All right, welcome everybody. And I imagine more people will join us soon. My name is Bernard Prusak, and I'm the director of the King's McGowan Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility. King's College is in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, as probably many of you know, and that's more or less the northeastern corner of the state. We had a snowy day, so if you're in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, thanks for joining us. Maybe you braved the 5 inches of snow to make it to school. Grateful everybody's here. Special thanks to our panelists, and especially special thanks to our main guests, namely Elizabeth Lizzie Shackelford. So let me do introductions. I have some more thanks to do as well. And then I'll talk about the structure of our event. So intros first. Elizabeth Shackelford is a senior fellow on U.S. foreign policy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which she joined just recently in January 2021, after a year with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Her analysis, writing, and outreach focus on building awareness and understanding of the value of robust diplomatic engagement. Ms. Shackelford was a career diplomat with the U.S. Department of State until December 2017, when she resigned in protest. Her resignation letter was the first to draw widespread attention to the declining state of diplomacy under the Trump administration. She's the author of the Dissent Channel, American Diplomacy in a Dishonest Age. Here it is, which won the 2020 Douglas Dillon Book Award. And it's also the book that she's going to discuss with us this afternoon. She just agreed with us that for her next book, her timing is going to be better. She'll be able to do a book tour in the flesh rather than virtually. As a Foreign Service officer, Ms. Shackelford served in Somalia, Kenya, South Sudan, Poland, and Washington, D.C. For her work in South Sudan during the outbreak of civil war there in 2013, she received the Barbara Watson Award for Consular Excellence, the State Department's highest honor for consular work. Thank you again for joining us. It's great to have you here. So I do want to thank, before I introduce the other panelists, two other persons. So one is Patrice Persico, who's the Associate Vice President for Institutional Advancement here at King's. And the other is her brother, and I think he just joined us, Dan Rittenhouse, who works in the State Department. They connected us to Lizzie, so thanks to you both. Okay, we have three distinguished panelists. One is a King student, Isa Dakto, more or less. I hope I got the pronunciation close, Isa. Isa is a senior majoring in political science at King's, where he is also the news director for the radio station WRKC and the president of the Model United Nations Club. And he's just been a great student to have at King's these 4 years. Aisha Ray is associate professor of political science at King's. Her research focuses on civil-military relations, conflict, and security issues in South Asia. She's the author of 2 books, The Soldier and the State in India, Nuclear Weapons, Counterinsurgency, and the Transformation of Indian Civil-Military Relations, which was published in 2013, and Culture, Context, and Capability, Comparing the American and Indian Counterinsurgency Experience, which was published in 2016. And finally, last but not least, Chris Scarborough is professor of history at King's. He's published widely on the question of the good life under socialism in Eastern Europe, including his 2011 book, The Late Socialist Good Life in Bulgaria, Meaning and Living in a Permanent Present Tense, and the co-edited volume, The Socialist Good Life, Desire, Development, and Standards of Living in Eastern Europe, which was published again in the happy year of 2020. In fall 2021, through the Fulbright Global Scholar Program, Chris will be conducting research in Bulgaria and serve as an invited scholar at the Center for Advanced Studies in Sofia. And all that is pandemic permitting, so fingers crossed. But I think, right? It'll happen. Okay, quick nuts and bolts. So a little bit about structure. Lizzie will talk about her book and its themes for about 15 minutes. And then our several panelists will engage her in discussion. We'll proceed alphabetically by first name. So Aisha will start us off and they'll engage one another as naturally as possible over Zoom. We'll do audience Q&A, and we'll do that through the chat. You're probably all familiar with Zoom by this point. but just in case you're not, the chat is there at the bottom. And what you want to do is to send questions to me. I'm one of the hosts, so Bernard Prusak, send the questions to me. I am planning to unmute people so long as Zoom will allow me to do so, so you can ask your question directly. But send your question first to me so I know whom to unmute, okay? And that's that. So thank you again, Lizzie. Thanks to the panelists and thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you so much, Bernard. I'm really excited to be here for this discussion, and I was really thrilled to be asked to have this opportunity. So, the discussion of today, it's on this book, but also on the theme, one of the main themes for my book of the importance of the role of dissent in governance and foreign affairs. And, the critical importance of dissent, it's not just in our government and our governance, but also really in any institution that you're part of. And the book touches on a few different themes, but that is one theme that runs throughout. It's an issue I find so important that I spent a couple of years writing a book about it. So I'll give you some background on kind of the overview of the book, and then I'll tie that into how this theme of the challenge when you do not open an institution up to dissenting views can really have some detrimental effects. And we've been watching that in our own governance over the past few years. So I'll start by telling you a little bit about the book. There is a main narrative storyline that is the bulk of the book, and that is my story, my personal firsthand account of being a junior U.S. diplomat serving in South Sudan in the lead up to and the outbreak of civil war. So that's the story that you read about. And throughout the book, I leave this story and I pull back to talk about how this picture, this storyline fits into a broader picture of how US foreign policy works and doesn't work, and how it has been and done so throughout history. So what you're reading in this book is my own educational experience of starting to recognize themes of how our foreign policy is driven by inertia and short-term thinking, and short-term political goals instead of being driven by kind of values and principles and long-term strategies that serve us in a much longer time period. The core principle that is at issue with my own dissent against our foreign policy is the matter of accountability in our foreign policy, and the ability or inability of the US government to hold our friends and partners to account. And I speak of this in kind of very granular on the ground examples, whether it's this friendly government to whom we have bestowed a lot of assistance and aid and political currency over the years, and how we cannot even on the ground keep them from arresting American citizens for no reason and extorting them, right there in front of our own eyes in Juba, the capital city. So that's, from that very kind of low level day-to-day thing that I experienced, where you talk about our inability to hold this government to account to its own laws in its interactions with ourselves, all the way up to the bigger picture of how our failure to hold them to account throughout led to our own complicity in the outbreak of violence against civilians in South Sudan and the beginning of this war. So that's your kind of main storyline. It's a war story, it's an adventure story, and it's a story from my own personal point of view. But I use this story to draw out lessons and truths about our own foreign policy. So throughout the book, it pulls back every few chapters to talk about how what I was experiencing as a US diplomat on the ground really fits into the bigger picture. So one example is chapter 3 is titled Human Rights, America's Just Not That Into You. This is something I was learning on the ground. And then I step back and talk about how this has been a theme throughout 50 years of US foreign policy, from the time when we first started even considering that human rights was a value that we are putting forward in our foreign policy, to present day, and how little what we say really is reflected in the actions of what we do on the ground. So that's kind of those two big stories. You have the South Sudan, or the US policy in South Sudan story, and then you have the US foreign policy story. But the third big theme of the book, and that comes back to what we're talking about today, is challenges within the State Department and the US federal government culture. And a big rub for me in that culture is that it is not a culture, a professional culture that promotes differing views, differences of opinion, and dissent. And what I learned throughout my time of developing my views and trying to push back against the prevailing policies of the day was that there just is not a great structure in the US government for finding ways to promote those conversations. Now, what's the important, what role does dissent play? Because a lot of people have asked me through my process of dissenting, going through formal channels within the State Department to officially file my dissenting opinions and views, what constitutes success in that scenario? And it's not necessarily that, as a second tour officer in South Sudan, I thought that once I sent a memo up to the Secretary of State's office that they should say, "You're right, we're totally wrong. We've got to change our entire policies." I didn't have that sort of idea, but success is when people say what we're doing isn't working, and we need to have a conversation about why that isn't working, and we need to start holding our own decisions and policymaking to account in terms of what those actions are leading to and whether or not they're actually promoting what we're doing in our foreign policy. So, one example, to draw one out from the book, of kind of I call it the worker bee level of dissent. So this is, again, I was not an ambassador. I was the second tour officer at the time. So I was busy doing a lot of our on the ground work. But one area where I tried to use dissent to push back on our policies was in South Sudan. A few months into the war, we had one of our congressionally mandated reports is on the use of child soldiers in countries where we're expending a lot of support, but where there is a history of the use of child soldiers. We have laws on the books that say, if a country is using child soldiers, we will not give them certain types of aid. Sounds very basic, sounds very straightforward. Of course, we shouldn't be giving military assistance to a country that's using child soldiers on the front lines. And as it turns out, as I learned while I was navigating these issues, it's a lot more complicated than that in practice. And in practice, we decide quite frequently that the sanctions that should automatically come through if you are to prove that there's the use of child soldiers in a country where we're providing assistance, there's an interest in continuing the assistance that we're doing. There's this inertia feel to our foreign policy, and that inertia drives things like wanting to continue programs that we have in place, and having this hesitance to stop programs. In the world of dissent, inertia is kind of your enemy, because those powers that propel us to continue doing the same thing that we've been doing make it very hard to change course. So I was charged with writing the report up about the use of child soldiers, an annual report. It involves box checking and answering certain questions, and you send it all back to Washington with a recommendation. And my simple response, and this is one of the tales that's told in the book, is, I see child soldiers on the streets in Juba. They're using child soldiers. We see them with our own eyes. That should trigger certain sanctions and certain changes in our behavior towards this country. And I was met in response with, it's important for us to continue our assistance because we're trying to change the behavior of the South Sudanese military and government. So I found myself coming up against this unwillingness to change, even in the light of really obvious examples right in front of us. My dissent in that case as a junior officer was to say, well, I've registered my recommendation that we don't continue the support and that we do not provide a waiver, which is the technical legal response if you're going to if you're not going to do sanctions when the sanctions criteria is met. And my protest was that I refused to write up the report for the requirements for the waiver that the South Sudanese government is supposed to submit to us so that we can give them a waiver. I refused to ghostwrite the waiver request on behalf of the South Sudanese government. And it's small. It wasn't something that changed our behavior. They just found someone else and tasked them to write it up for them. But I had registered my concern. And for me, that was a small win because it was acknowledged and it was on the record. Did it change our behavior in the long term? No. But that gets into the questions of how we use dissent in our own professional spaces. And I wanted to, I could go on with many stories in that book, from the book about what I did. But what I find really compelling today is that I've been looking back over the past few years of how the lack of a culture of dissent has really affected our government's ability to function in really trying times. Our unwillingness to really to engage in conversations over dissenting views and push back against prevailing positions. Back when, 2014, which is the time period that we're talking about in the book, 2014, 2015, when I actually filed an official dissent cable, the costs were that we just kept doing what we were doing. And that was unsurprising. But what it kept us from doing was having a more robust conversation that might have led us to change decisions and change policy decisions. But you fast forward a few years later to an administration that was very different from the Obama administration. And you started seeing signs of the real long-term costs to our government's functionality by not having that type of dissent. And one thing that kept coming to mind, if you think back to what I guess almost a year and a half ago, when we were going into the first period of the first impeachment of Donald Trump. And all of this came about for a fairly narrow scope issue of military assistance to Ukraine. And the fact that people in our government were using these levers of the government for personal political gain, or were trying to. It's a very small situation, which had very big potential ramifications. But mind you, it's one country. It's our interactions with one country and a phone call with one country. And people were really amazed to see members of the State Department and our national security teams under subpoena come forward and speak up about this situation. And what I kept thinking was, my God, how many more things like this have been happening that no one has come forward to speak up about? And we'll never know. But I can't help but think that some of why we had such limitations on people being willing to come forward and on the functionality of our IG offices and our various other forms of oversight was because the culture had been built up over decades. That was one where you move ahead in these institutions by getting along and smoothing out problems, not creating more. So for me, that hint that I had of how dangerous it was to allow inertia to drive things and to, quash opportunities for critical self-reflection that come from championing voices of dissent and engaging voices of dissent. The real cost is that when you come to a crisis situation and there are people in the organization who do not share even the same values and goals as much of the rank and file do, you miss the opportunity to have people bring those challenges forward, and the lack of a dissent function becomes even more detrimental. So I will wrap up my remarks there. I just wanted to give some thoughts both on the book and how it ties into some of the challenges that we've seen in the recent years and that we will continue to see. But as part of my promotion for, whether you're in the government or in any organization, there are huge benefits to fostering that discussion. And to the point that you fail to do so, you lose those whistleblowers who have an opportunity, to really call things out when, the very continuation of your system of democracy, for example, is at risk. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Bernard.
Great, thank you very much. So Aisha, do you want to start our questioning? And I see that there are some questions already in the chat, which is just great. I had about 6 or 7 questions that came to my own mind while you were talking, Lizzie. Thank you. Aisha, take it away.
Thanks, Bernard. And thanks, Elizabeth. It's really a pleasure to be on this panel with you. And this is such an important topic, and I'm glad, that we're discussing it. So I definitely applaud you for your courage to kind of break from the norm. I have two questions at the outset, which sort of concerns the theme of human rights, which is, prevalent throughout the entire book. And kind of at the heart of the question is sort of the tension in the means versus ends in American foreign policy, right? The U.S. has a record of pushing, a foreign policy record of pursuing objectives and goals abroad that are, in fundamental contradiction to the values it purportedly espouses, right, or stands for. So where do the answers to that problem lie, right? And in your book, you do mention things like American exceptionalism. You do mention, unrestrained capitalism, and how, like, when commercial and economic interests really push that too. And I was really fascinated by that as well. That has been one of the biggest challenges, you say, to American national interest. And also sort of the role of personalities that struck me, like, Susan Rice, right? US ambassador to the UN. I mean, this was somebody who wasn't even willing to use the word genocide when there was actually a genocide happening. And so we have people as well. So the first thing is, where do the answers to this question lie? And the second is, it seems like we need, at least the United States needs, a new charter on human rights, right? And so what would this charter, according to you, look like? Now, with a caveat, because, America sometimes does too much and has also violated human rights. And Iraq comes to mind, of course, right? And so where's that line where, you do promote human rights, but you're not kind of crossing the line as well, and making a mess of foreign policy even further? So those are the two interrelated questions first. Thanks.
All right, wonderful. I mean, for me, it's often posed as a question of, when do you sacrifice human rights to national interest? When do you sacrifice human rights to national security? And I think that that's a false premise to start from. And it gets back to a lot of what you're also saying of, okay, if you're championing human rights, how do you do that without making a mess? For me, all of this comes back to a question of short-term views and interests versus long-term views and interests. It is in America's long-term national security interest to consistently and reliably promote and defend human rights overseas and at home. Whenever any of those cases where people are really finding specifics to talk about, okay, but is torture okay if you're going to be able to save a lot of other people? I mean, they all fall flat once you start to probe what are the real outcomes of that sacrificing of human rights. And in my experience, and I saw this in South Sudan, those times when we thought that you could look the other way helped build something that became an entrenched bad behavior. And if you start prioritizing human rights early on in, let's say, a country like South Sudan, you start linking the behavior of the government in its human rights record to the types of assistance that you are and are not willing to provide. If you do that early when the stakes are low, you create expectations and you shape behavior. If you say, well, it's inconvenient to do that now because it's really important that we let this government get up on its feet. And these are the types of things that we hear, right? It's a young country. You can expect they're gonna, have some issues with their rebel turned state military. But the problem is when you bypass human rights early, it becomes a fundamental security and stability problem later on. Because countries where the governments respect the rights of their citizens and work by the rule of law are ultimately more stable. They're more functional. They have less corruption. And that is all within our national security interest. So let's look at an issue like, somewhere like Iraq. You've got the similar long-term, short-term issue, where there's certainly some human rights reasons to go in and to stay in Iraq for a while. There were, but what are the human rights costs of the short-term gains that were made? And if you're looking at the long-term picture, I don't think that you can say that we have secured human rights or left the situation better than we have before. If you look at questions like right now with whether or not we withdraw from Afghanistan, a huge argument against it is, you're going to have such problems with human rights if the US military leaves, and what about the rights of women, et cetera, et cetera. How many human rights are we defending at the moment with our military presence? And if you add up our military presence there over the past 20 years, what has been, what has been the balance cost to human lives? So I think it's complicated, and it's hard to look back and say X country is worse off and X country's citizens are worse off now than they were 20 years ago. It's hard to back that up with data. But I think that it's fair to say that we can certainly not prove that places are better off because of human rights ideals that we had 20 years ago. And I think when it comes to how we value that and how we integrate it into our foreign policy, I think prioritizing human rights is tremendously important. But the question is, how do you prioritize it? I think it means ensuring we do less harm rather than necessarily affirmatively ensuring that we do good. The United States has proven that we've got a bad track record for nation building and democracy promotion. Would it be better off if we tried to do less in terms of interventions and tried to do more in terms of leading by example and reinforcing the countries that we work with that have solid records on human rights? So, being someone, I am a self-described, human rights advocate, but that does not always mean that you intervene. It often means that you do less harm, and that's the thing that you can most control. I am certain there are aspects of your question that I did not answer, so let me know what I should turn to now.
No, that's definitely helpful. I was just kind of thinking, in terms of, again, shared values. Right now, India comes to mind, where internally the domestic, the human rights, issue is full on the table, and the current government in India has been violating human rights, right? But here we have two countries that are democracies and supposedly have these shared values, and so is the United States just going to ignore the human rights violations that are happening within India because we are democracies? You know what I mean? And so sometimes democracies commit those crimes even within their countries or outside, even if they are democratic or they have those values. So India just sort of popped into my mind because, we sort of do share similar values strategically and in terms of national interest and global partnership, right? But it's not so simple, I guess, on the ground.
I mean, you're right. None of it is so simple, which is why we need to really clearly define, what our priorities and what our parameters are. And this reminds me, exactly what you're speaking about reminds me of this dilemma that you've got the Biden administration facing right now. There's this big push for America's back and we're going to work with democracies. And there's a big move for, wanting to have an international democracy summit. Who do you invite to an international democracy summit? Does America even qualify after our craziness that happened in the last electoral process? I think that these are important questions to be asking. I think what you do is you find the baseline where you have things in common and you promote. I also believe strongly that the other democracies of the world, and not even just relying on the democratic aspect, but the human rights promoters in the world, are looking at the United States right now and saying, we have some criticisms for you. So I think it's essential at this stage, in a way that's heavier than it's been in many years, that the United States starts out by leading by example, by demonstrating that we can improve our own track record. I personally believe that we should be re-entering the international stage with some humility, because so much of what has happened in the United States are the types of things that a few years ago, the United States would have said that would never happen in the United States. So we should be doing outreach with friendly countries and partners, and that includes countries like India. But we should do so by saying, here are places where, by entering into a dialogue among equals who are struggling with some similar issues. We should hold all of our friends to account, much as we should do for ourselves. So what does this mean in practice with a country like India? It means that we economically engage, we applaud them for things that are working well there, but at the same time that we have the honest conversations that we often do not have for fear of affecting our influence. And this is an issue that I saw with our foreign policy at the absolute baby steps level. We have this deep, deep fear, despite thinking of ourselves as, the biggest, most influential country in the world, which in many ways we are. We have this terrible fear of losing our access and influence to other countries. And we need to get over that, because we need to be willing to say to the government of South Sudan early on, before it's a real mess, what you're doing in Jonglei State, where you're providing weapons to a rebel group to slaughter your own people, that's not good. And when you say that early on, then you've laid the groundwork for being able to show that you're standing by those beliefs and that you don't seem hypocritical later on when you bring it up. So with a much bigger partner like India, it's late in the game to be doing this, but we do need to reassert a baseline. This is the type of behavior that we think is that we find acceptable and would like to promote. This is the type of behavior that we don't. Are there costs to that? We're going to have to look at all of these bilateral relationships as a whole and decide. But I think the most important thing at this stage that we need to do before we're able to really carry it to other countries is to show that we see these criticisms of ourselves and that we're able to change our own country. And then we use that to lead by example.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'll let everyone else chime in. Chris and Isa, maybe.
So I guess I'll ask my question, and I'll echo Aisha, and thank you for being here. And it's really a pleasure to be on a panel with you. So I'm a historian, and I guess I'll start by asking a question that your title raised with me, this idea of American diplomacy in a dishonest age. So I guess it's in part a question of periodization, right? When does this dishonest age begin, right? How do we know it's dishonest? Are there antecedents for a more honest diplomacy? And what did that look like? Maybe what lessons does it hold moving forward? I have other questions, but I'll maybe sort of let it go sort of circulate, and then I'll get back to you, I'm sure. So I'll leave it at that for now.
I mean, that's an excellent question, because I often look at that subtitle and think to myself, oh, those other ages I was thinking about, those weren't so honest either. Part of me looks at this approach to, the obvious age that we might think about is this, post World War II, UN, human rights charter, everything emerging with this liberal world order. But I think it's a great question, is that entire age a dishonest age in many ways? And I think that looking at that, the aspirations that we had and how quickly we moved into more of a kind of tactical a la carte approach to all of those things that we were claiming to be our foundation. So I feel as though that entire period, the one that we are kind of reevaluating now, has fully been in many ways a dishonest age, with different players along the way trying to shift us. And I have a chapter in the book, the chapter on human rights. I talk about Congress in the post-Vietnam era. I talk about Jimmy Carter, and I talk about these moves that there were to internalize into our legal system human rights as an actual element of our foreign policy. And that was really the first time that we were starting to put some of our human rights reports into place. We had an office in the State Department dedicated to human rights. Human rights isn't all of it, right? But it is a big topic in the book. And it's a big aspect, I think, of our dishonesty, which is we claim that it matters as long as it suits us in other realms that it matters. And we turn away from it whenever it doesn't. So I feel as though the dishonest aspect is that we've been spending decades talking about how we are a global leader in areas such as human rights, rule of law, and democracy. And the dishonesty isn't just externally, we're dishonest with ourselves. And that's part of probably the biggest hurdle to overcome. And even as I listen to some very, very smart people who have returned to the administration under the Biden team, I wonder just how honest are they with some of the problems and challenges of our foreign policy in a prior era. But it gets back to that hubris point that I brought up, in the need for humility instead of hubris. I believe that, and again, I'm not sure if I've even answered your question, but generally speaking, I believe that it's been dishonest and unworkable for a long time, or ineffective for a long time, because we're not being honest with ourselves about what our role has been in the world and where it's been positive and where it hasn't. So my request for anyone from the Biden administration listening is, to take a hard look at those decisions that we had back then, because I worry deeply that now that America's back, are we just back to 26, status quo ante 2016, which, as my book, which is written largely about that period of time, pre 2016, demonstrates, it's not a time period in which we were very honest about what we were doing in the world.
Right. I mean, that's one of the things I really appreciated about your book, was that it was in many ways a story of a dawning awareness, right? As you described it beforehand, as sort of this a process of education. Because in some ways, for me, the Carter period is the exception that proves the rule, right? And so when we think about, your chapter, Human Rights, America is just not that much into you. In some ways, I wonder if in fact, the absence of paying attention to human rights is not an aberration of American values, but rather it's fulfillment, right? I mean, one way to think about American foreign policy, not just since the Second World War, but from the very beginning, has been about promoting the expansion of markets and sort of geopolitical power, right? And so the dishonesty maybe is, in fact, paying attention to human rights at all. And so I wonder if that's a way of thinking about it, right? If the hypocrisy that you're talking about, or the dishonesty that you're talking about, is that we're we pay lip service to human rights, but really don't put those words into action. Maybe the lip service is the problem, right?
I've come to this many times myself, because at my heart, I am a human rights advocate, and it's not just for altruistic reasons. I mean, you live in a war zone, you see the absolute levels of in just human suffering, and you cannot help but think there is something to that idea that we should all be promoting human rights. But at the end of the day, I also recognize that the goal of U.S. foreign policy is to promote American interests. So on the one hand, I would agree with you. I think it would be a far more honest approach to our foreign policy if we just said, you know what, we're big corporate free traders, and we're out there to dominate in every possible way. And if it helps you along the way, that's cool, but we're not particularly concerned about it. That would be more honest. And I think that would be a better reflection of what we've effectively really done in the past few decades. Where I take issue with it is that I feel that approach to our foreign policy will undermine us in the long run. Because I feel that having a transactional relationship with, different, countries across the Middle East, and that type of approach is not going to provide the long-term stability. I had this conversation many times about kind of the post-Arab Spring period, with this idea of, well, you see, the problem is that we were, we shouldn't have been supporting these kind of movements towards freedom and democracy. I'm like, the problem isn't that. The problem is that we helped prop up really abusive governments for many decades. You release a dog from a cage and it bites you. It's not the problem that you released it from the cage. It's the problem that you had in the cage for 3 weeks. So it's again, taking it back to a much longer term view. The challenge with that long-term view is that it only works if we're consistent. It only works if it's something that we can reliably, be looked to consistently promote rule of law, democracy, and human rights. Because if you're doing it as we are now, which is very much a la carte, nobody can rely on you for that. And you don't get the dividends. You really only kind of get the costs when they come up. So that's where I look at it. Now, again, I can't prove this with data, because we've never consistently tried to make human rights a major principle on which we base our foreign policy. But I do know what we have been doing hasn't been working very well. So, maybe it's time we gave that a try.
If I may, just briefly, and I know I don't want to, another maybe even more radical response to that is to begin the process of rethinking American interests and the relationship between human rights and things like global capitalism, right? And these are things that we could take seriously, but that would require really radical reexamination and rethinking what it means to be American and about what American interests are. So, I mean, it seems to me that that's where the problem often rests, right? That's where the contradictions come in. So
absolutely, and you hit the fundamental challenge at the very beginning of that statement, which is, what are American interests? And I speak a lot about the challenges of how militarized our foreign policy is. And there's this big belief, I mean, Americans just take it for granted that having a big military is in our interest because it provides for our defense. And all you have to do is look at the last year to say that our greatest national security threat was a pandemic that we could not address, that our military could do nothing for us there. So I think you are right. I think we do need to do a radical rethink of what American interests are. I think you're absolutely right that should involve some review of this kind of American capitalism that we've been promoting, because it's pretty clear today. Again, you can look at the example of what's been happening during this pandemic, that Americans are far worse off than a lot of their counterparts across the globe. We are not, what we are doing now is not defending the Americans' interests. And we've been laying the groundwork for that for a long time. So you get to ideas like, is it in the American interest from a foreign policy and domestic policy perspective that Americans have a reasonable minimum wage? You know, that's kind of radical thinking. People don't think about that in terms of overall, but if we did that, would we be in a better position to be able to enforce, basic labor trade standards overseas and still retain some jobs at home? I mean, that's the type of thing where it does really interact, but only if you're looking at a big picture and a long-term view. So definitely.
Great, thank you. Isa, why don't we turn to you at this point?
It's like, I'll echo the same thing that Dr. Scarborough and Dr. Ray say, thank you for coming on today. I low-key feel like a junior political officer, at a table full of, the ambassador and, senior political officials. So there's a little of that too there. But, sort of to echo what Dr. Scarborough said and what you have said as well, Lizzie, like, the military, as we're seeing, just in the U.S. budget alone, it takes almost not the whole thing, but a really good portion of it. And you even mentioned in your book that the military is starting to do things that, usually U.S. aid would do, or other, foreign service, type of things would do as well. One of the examples was AFRICOM, if I pronounced that right, and how even despite them trying to install a, senior civilian leadership, that at the end of the day, it ultimately failed. So really, I guess my question for you is what's the best way to reduce their role and, increase the role of the Department of State? Because there's only so much we can use a military for when, especially when we mention Iraq, Afghanistan, when the military's presence is hostile, but, versus civilians. So how do you think it'd be possible for them to reduce that? Or is it possible even?
So it's a great question. And I think it actually ties in well with what Christopher was saying earlier about, American interests. Like, if we redefined American interests and if we redefined national security threats, I think that would place us in a better position to be able to justify shifting a lot of our resources from defense to our civilian foreign policy tools. And not just that, but to the types of things that we've been neglecting at home: education, healthcare, infrastructure. You can look at a lot of countries around the world that have much lower percentages of their GDP, going towards defense, much lower parts of their actual budget going towards defense, and many of our European allies have far better infrastructure and other aspects that really help people at home. Now, the big challenge is the political one. You can ask people in the military, generals at the highest levels have defended fully resourcing in the State Department. It's a different thing when you tell them we're going to have to take those toys from you in order to do so. But there is a lot of support for that idea. The issue really comes to money, and it comes to Capitol Hill. It comes to where the constituents are. And it's very easy to rally support behind the US military. It's very easy to rally support behind big money aspects of the US military, like contracts that support a lot of industries across the country, which in many ways has become kind of a subsidy in different communities. And your elected representation in Washington is going to defend that to the death. There have been, I think I talk about this some in the book, but there have been cases over the years where the military has said, here's a handful of bases that we should close because we have effectively no use for them and they're expensive. And even when the military says that they want to do that, you still struggle to get them approved through Congress because people vote for jobs in their hometown, people vote for the military, they understand the military. So I think a big part of it is changing public perceptions and public awareness of what the money and the resources that we need to put towards diplomacy and development are used for and why they matter. I've been on a couple of panels recently, a couple of task forces that are talking about kind of how do we re-envision, the State Department as a more effective organization, because it is, like so many organizations, outdated and a little screwy. And one way to do that is to start investing in educating Americans about what we do so that they care about it, so that they support those budgets. The Department of Defense and the CIA both have entertainment liaisons in Hollywood. That sounds ridiculous, but why it didn't come about by accident that so many Americans have such positive images of what we put towards those sides of our national security funding. It's been promoted actively. I'm not saying the State Department should start rolling out movies, but I do think that finding a way to communicate what diplomats and development professionals and other civilian sides of our foreign policy do for Americans. I think that this past year is a great year to use as an example, because this has been a battle that we cannot fight with the military. And I think that, as we've got an administration that is looking to re-engage with the world, we need to help Americans understand why that's important for them back home.
It's like also in addition as well, I might add just one more, like as well as like, I remember also one of the things, I believe it was also in your third chapter as well, the events of Somalia and the Battle of Mogadishu that went down. It seems like despite that event, it seems like the military is still going. Is that just because they're just more resourceful that they can still carry out those things? Because again, it seems like the DOS is heavily neglected in that regard.
Well, we did end up pulling out of Somalia for quite some time, but when it became in the interest of kind of the counterterrorism war to go back in, it wasn't a problem at all for a few reasons. One is they just have the resources to do what they like to do, and two is if you couch anything in terms of we're fighting terrorists, it's really not hard to get money for that. The challenge is, trying to draw that line, what we're doing in Somalia, back to American national security interests. And I find the Somalia example a fascinating one, because it's a very tidy example of these small wars that we have in a lot of parts of the world that Americans know very little about. But they just kind of trust at the end of the day that what's being done is probably protecting us from terrorists. My view on Somalia in particular is I actually think that they're making us more vulnerable to terrorists, because as long as we have troops on the ground and we are fighting in a war there, which we are, even with small numbers, and even if most of it's done from the air, you are giving insurgents a reason to target Americans. Now, are there reasons to work with the Somali government to help create stability in the Horn of Africa? It's an incredibly strategic place. Absolutely. But is using our military the best way to do so? And is it not perhaps actually putting us at greater risk? So, it gets back to, there are very few times when we're doing a good job of demonstrating how our military activity really does tie back to concrete US national interests. What we haven't done a good job at all is actually demonstrating where we've prevented conflict by engaging diplomatically. It's hard to prove prevention. But we do need to start telling those stories more so that people have greater support for that. And on the military side, I actually think it would do us well if we started sharing the stories of what didn't work, how much it cost, and how much instability it has created in a lot of these communities where, our drones accidentally kill civilians. It happens frequently. So I think being able to, trying to educate Americans enough so that they hold our officials to account, when we're spending our money and our service members' lives in these places, would do a lot of good. So they have a better understanding and have informed consent over what we're doing with our military overseas.
I'm enjoying this very much and learning from it. I'd like to go round one more time with the panels, but I think maybe it makes sense to turn now to some Q&A from the audience, since we'll be able to ask further questions as well. So I've got a number of questions. I'm going to unmute first Margarita Rose, who has a question about constituency for foreign policy. So Lizzie, you were speaking about that territory more or less a few minutes ago. So here we go. Margarita, I hope you can be unmuted.
Thank you, Bernard, and thank you, Lizzie. Thanks to all the panel. Lizzie, I have a dear friend who I actually spent the last week with, who's retired from the Foreign Service. And I remember a few years ago, he said to me, there is no constituency for foreign aid. And I think we can extend that and say there's no constituency for human rights. Now, you've elaborated a bit, given us some guidance already, but I am involved with and know nationally many people, individuals and organizations that really would prefer to give priority to human rights over military presence or market expansion, as we talked about earlier. So do you have any further thoughts on how you guide these individuals and organizations to really create a constituency for human rights?
That's a really great question, because there are some examples on concrete issues where it has worked very well. And South Sudan actually is a very clear example of where you've had interested individuals and organizations and religious groups combining forces and really effectively lobbying Congress to bring change. Now, what happened at the time, and this is, so we're taking us back to pre-South Sudan's independence, during the Second Sudanese Civil War. And I write about this in the book. It's this fascinating thing because South Sudan has absolutely no strategic utility for the United States. And yet it became one of the biggest recipients of donor funding and support and political support across, across the African continent, certainly, and beyond. Now, I mean, we'll fast forward to the fact that the outcomes of that were pretty poor because of all of the reasons we were talking about, because of the short-sightedness and the fact that we were so focused on making it this success story of independence that we failed to see the writing on the wall and actually promote human rights in the new country as well as the old. But there's some really good lessons in terms of what worked effectively on that. The lobbying push was organized by like-minded groups, and that involved religious organizations that were interested in promoting the human rights of the Christians in the South versus kind of their position within the largely Muslim country of Sudan. And that combined forces with human rights groups that were not religious at all, but wanted to really push for ending. This was the longest running civil war on the continent. And that all timed fairly well with a US interest in opposing Sudan. So I think that the big lesson there is to find a hook that fits with, kind of the natural US national security issues, which in this case was that Sudan had been, basically a state that provided shelter for terrorists and had provided, some level of support for, the rising Al-Qaeda movement. And we had a lot of beef with that state. So they used that interest that you already had in Washington, and then they fostered additional interest through Congress towards this very specific matter of the rights of the Southerners within Sudan. And it was quite effective. I think the factors that made it successful were that it was a specific country and a specific issue, and it aligned well with interests that were already present in DC. Never mind the fact that that turned into a horrible disaster later on. But at the time, in terms of a lobbying effort, it was very important. And I think the way to build the constituency is to very smartly target specific members of Congress, because that is where things happen. And if you work towards tangible goals, we need a bill, we need to end the war in Yemen. That was a very tangible goal that came counter for a while to what the US military found to be in our interests. But it ultimately, the public support that you had from different groups that were interested in ending the war in Yemen has really shown some progress, because it started to work. There was pressure already and a lot of interest on the Hill. And then as it started to align with shifting US national security interests, it's making real headway now, which is wonderful to see. But I would say you can do targets and really, find people who have the ear of, congressmen and women and senators. I think on the bigger picture, one of the movements that I am really interested in, and I think I am starting to see some broad interest in, and a place we might be able to build a constituency, is a general push against wars of choice and trying to press for a greater use of diplomacy. So I think that's another area where, finding a way to translate it that works with US national security interests, which I believe it does, and finding certain advocates on the Hill. And that's you've got a bit of a movement in the foreign policy community. It's small, but it is interested. And the more forces you can combine behind it to hit more representatives coming out of different states, that's how you build that inertia to get things into law that can really make change.
One more question from the audience. So I'd like to ask Noreen O'Connor to unmute if she would. She wanted to ask a question about rebuilding the State Department. And I'm going to have a follow-up question to her question about culture of dissent. So I got asked to ask a question about dissent. Noreen, are you there?
Yes, I'm sorry. My video doesn't seem to be turning on. That's okay. I just had a question. There's so much discussion now about Biden rebuilding the State Department, how much it was kind of cleared out. And I know I have many friends that live in DC and had heard even that positions were not being filled from the beginning of the Trump administration. So do you see this as an opportunity at this time to rebuild in a way that might kind of undo the inertia, the way things used to be? And how could it be built to be put on a more stable footing to support human rights? Is there some kind of structure or set of programs that you would in particular recommend?
Wonderful question. And yes, it is. I do see an opportunity right now. I will start by saying, the State Department hasn't been wholly gutted. I've got a wonderful friend who's on this call, Dan Rittenhouse, who's one of the wonderful people who stayed behind. We are lucky to have fewer people who marched away like I did, and more really high quality people who stayed. But I would absolutely agree that one of the benefits of having kind of burned down our foreign policy, which is largely what happened in the last few years, is that you have a better opportunity to rebuild now than you ever have before. With every new administration, you are stuck with a whole slew of special envoys offices and presidential initiatives and things that have come with new administration after new administration. It's always hard to shut things down. So what we end up doing is, instead of having some holistic shift, we just kind of tweak around the edges and layer more institutional efforts on top of others. So I think we've got an interest now to really make some structural change. The challenge is going to come to whether or not, in all of the crises we're facing, the new administration is willing to take the hard time that it's going to require to really institute some of these changes. I've been involved in a lot of discussions on, some of the groups making many recommendations. And I think there's going to be a positive move in some areas. I don't believe that this administration is going to turn its back on commitments to things like increasing diversity in the State Department, and not just at the hiring level, but up through the ranks, and finding ways to ensure that, all of that boring HR stuff that needs to be changed in order to ensure that you're not wheedling out people of color and women as you move up through the ranks. I do think there's going to be still a commitment to making that change. In other areas, I'm less certain that there's that sense of urgency. Like, for example, we've heard, representatives of the Biden administration and Biden himself speak out about, how we're going to rebuild diplomacy and put it back in the lead. But at the same time, I don't see any move to, you can put State Department in the lead, but if you're not doing anything to reassess that balance between the military and the State Department, the military is just going to continue taking the lead effectively because it's so much better resourced and it has such a better constituency, in the American public and on the Hill. So I think some of those I think there will be structural improvements in some ways. We will be fully staffed. I believe we're going to get more money in the State Department and more people. And I think all of that's great and important. In terms of addressing some of the underlying issues, such as, how human rights fits in, for example, because right now you have a bureau that covers human rights that's kind of like the redheaded stepchild and nobody particularly cares what they say. I think those are going to be harder cultural shifts to make because I don't see them as prioritized by this administration. But, so cautious optimism there. I think we're going to have some wins, but not all.
Thank you.
Let me ask the question about dissent. I don't know if I'll quite satisfy the person who wants me to ask it, but in any event, this person's interested in more about hearing more about the promotion or suppression of dissent in the government. So, Lizzie, here's how I'm going to put it, and you could say a lot. So, in your book, it's a chapter entitled "Quieting the Voices of Opposition." You talk about your formal dissent that you put through the Dissent Channel. And you say at the very end of that chapter that it means something, perhaps, that the State Department has such a dissent channel. It's a message of sorts. One could generally describe it as a type of departmental suggestion box, though it would be more accurate to picture it as a shredder. Your title of the book, The Dissent Channel, your representation of the dissent channel is maybe not the most optimistic, let's say. So how do you go about changing the culture of the State Department? We'll just focus on the State Department so that there is better use of dissent, there is more of a voice for dissent, so that your experience isn't the norm, which it sounds like it currently is.
So an interesting thing happened after the book was released. And it's hard to find information on the Dissent Channel. As I write about in the book, I mean, you can't find examples of Dissent Channel cables to read and review. They're locked away. Nobody has access to them. So I was quite dissuaded by my own personal experience. But in talking to a lot of other counterparts at other agencies, the Dissent Channel is like the stuff of legends. Like, other agencies don't even have this channel to use. So the State Department does start out at a higher level than a lot of organizations by having created this formal channel. But after the book came out, not long after, I got an email from, it was a couple of women who had been in the Foreign Service back in the 70s when the Dissent Channel was established. And it was established in response to a lot of angst and anger and frustration in the State Department over our policies in Vietnam, understandably so. It was created not to fashion a way to change our positions, because the White House had decided what we were going to do, and State Department's many cables back about how terrible it was not going to change anything. But it was created almost as like a release valve. I kind of envision it like releasing the gas so that people feel as though they've had their say. That said, these women who had been in the Foreign Service and had long stellar careers, but had worked their way through the ranks, remembered when it was established. And they were like, did you know that in the early days, there was this associated lunch program that happened regularly where people got together and they talked about these issues, and you'd have a high level, whatever, I don't know, deputy assistant secretary or somebody kind of hosting a lunch to foster discussion on policy issues. And it was fascinating to me because I never heard of this. I wasn't aware that was part of it, and it kind of faded away over time. The people I was speaking to about it couldn't tell if that was, kind of intentional because it was becoming difficult, or it just kind of lost steam because, there are no opportunities for kind of, promotion through, managing that type of effort. But it got me thinking about, we have a formal structure. Are there ways that we can, if I am not being my most cynical self, and we really do want to foster these discussions, how do we do that? How do we ensure that younger officers are encouraged to raise their concerns, and not just to think that a win is changing policy, because that's not going to happen often, but how do you ensure that you're heard? And I think that there are ways that we could do it through boring bureaucratic means. We could reestablish this conversational opportunity. We could ensure that non-classified dissent cables are actually something that other people in the department can read, so that they can learn from these issues. If you kind of read some of the histories of dissents over time, because there are a few, the American Foreign Service Association and others have kind of gathered some of this together. There are a couple of books. It usually is something fairly prescient that, like, 10 years later, everybody admits was 100% true. But at the time, these issues were too politically controversial to push forward. So I do think there is room for opening that conversation up more. And I've heard some talk of that in these State Department kind of task force groups discussing how we can improve and change things. So I think there's space for that. And I hope that the State Department takes that on, and that is then an example that can be, repeated in other agencies.
Thank you. It's 5 after 5. We'll go 10 more minutes. We'll stop at 5:15. So I'm wondering if our panelists would like to ask some more questions. You need to be a little quick, especially if we're to go all the way around again. So take it away. Here we go. We're on the clock here.
Okay, I'll go fast. And Bernard, thanks for asking that question on dissent, because that was the question I was going to ask next. So I'll branch off a little bit, and I just am curious to know, what kind of specific challenges you faced being a female diplomat in the field of national security, which is very male dominated. So there's a lot of, the cultural sort of aspect to that. And then also being a female diplomat working in dangerous conflict zones. What's been your experience? Thanks.
All right, I'm going to try and give quicker answers too, so that we can get to more. Yes, I mean, the national security field is definitely male dominated, and it's actually even more of a problem in the US than it is with many of our European counterparts. So I think that there's a greater appreciation and understanding of that now, but there is still not a full understanding in the organization of the State Department, like with everywhere else, of how unconscious bias affects people, how unconscious bias affects people's opportunities. These kind of subtle ideas of, well, if you've got a toddler at home, you probably don't want to go on that particular trip, and that trip's a great opportunity for any rising star in the State Department. So those types of things we still have to address. And I'm not sure how many people saw the news over the last year, but the administration, the Trump administration, canceled all unconscious bias training across the government. So we have to get back to where we were before and then improve on it. But I think awareness is a huge part of that. And there are a lot of kind of grassroots efforts to kind of build and support women moving up in the national security field, which is great. In terms of being a woman in places like Somalia and South Sudan, it's different wherever you go. In Somalia, if you're in Mogadishu, there's some incredibly empowered women who are involved in the political scene. But of course, for anything outside of that circle, you have cultural issues that make it very difficult to move ahead. We use our Western ideas. So, well, if we just increase the number of women in parliament, that's going to make things better, right? And it's these short-term fixes don't work because they don't address kind of cultural structural change. But as a woman working in these places, I found a couple of things. One, they always assumed I was going to bring up women's issues, and I frequently did. And if anybody needed to talk about it, they would come to me because I was the woman. But you do have this leverage as being an American woman in these different spaces and sectors. You're invited into the room when Somali women, for example, might not be. But again, Mogadishu is far more ahead of that than other places. I didn't find it to be different. In South Sudan, it was a different case. South Sudanese women are incredibly strong. It's still a very male-dominated society. But my challenge there was that I was just far too small. I mean, it was like hard to get a presence in the room because they're very large people. But I found that it gave me access to people and conversations, like particularly in places like going through IDP camps to talk to victims of violence. I had access that maybe other people wouldn't always have. So you use the benefits that you have and you try and change the costs.
Thanks. Chris?
I'll also try to be brief. I guess one of my questions is how one comes to arrive at the values that we're going to promote. I mean, in your book, you talk about a more effective and a more honest diplomacy of being one that deals with pressure and consequences, aid contingent on positive outcomes and good behavior. So I'd like to know who determines what is a positive outcome, what is good behavior, and how does America in that iteration escape the charge of neocolonialism?
Well, for starters, it's impossible to give a short answer to this, but I'm going to try because it's not an easy problem to overcome. I mean, it sounds great, right? Like, well, just impose our value system. You can't just do that. But I try to talk about in the book that it's less about what I actively think that we should be doing and more about what I think we should not be doing. So, it is not neocolonial to, if you aren't providing aid, it's not neocolonial to say we can talk about that once you stop, basically providing weapons for rebels who are terrorizing civilians in X state. Now, it is, perceived as neocolonial anytime an outsider is trying to basically shape behavior. But I think that comes back to, it is in our interest that you are a functional country that has the rule of law and has stability amongst a variety of populations in your country. That's in our interest because you're in a strategic area. And so we think that if you're oppressing this one sector of the population, that's unstable. That could lead to violence that destabilizes a region that's important to us. And you use that by saying, we'd like to help you with X, but just have our own standards in place at the outset. If we have reports of human rights abuses coming out of this particular military unit, we don't provide funding to them. We're not saying you have to change your behavior. We're just not going to fund that behavior. And it's actually remarkable how much we do that has negative externalities because we're not paying attention at the front end about what the implications are. I think it says the same to, like us incorporating human rights better into our foreign policy might have less to do with what we're expecting them to do and more with what we're expecting us to do. So drone wars in places like Somalia and Yemen, for example, we don't need to tell the Somalis to stop dropping drones on civilians. We could stop dropping drones on civilians and make that a higher priority in our own foreign policy. So I think it comes back to the place to start is first do no harm. And we have to care about that harm and track that harm in order to be able to not impose it. And right now, I feel as though with that short-term view of our foreign policy, we're too quick to say it's good enough that we're trying to kill these terrorists over here. And we put a higher priority on that than first doing the groundwork to ensure that we're not inadvertently going to cause a clan war by doing so. That was an attempt at a short answer on a really complicated question. But I do think we need to sit down, though, as a country, as an administration, and spell out what do we want our foreign policy outcomes to be? And with the tools we're using, how do we get there? And I don't think we've done that very well.
Isa, I think it's right to give you the last question.
Thank you. So my last question, I guess, I'll try and keep it brief, but, given how many times, with starting from the Obama administration, like recently, then switching to Trump, and then now the policy changes again with President Biden, it seems more or less, that it's more personalities or what of the current moment, as you said, the short-term goals are. So it got me thinking, because I learned it as well at Dr. Ray's class with our Intro to Security Studies, but it's the realist versus the liberal school of thoughts and how to conduct policy. So my question, I guess, would be then, is there more of a realist approach to where it's more focused, well, we said primarily on the military and more of ourselves first, or is it more focused more on the liberal side where we use, the institutions? Because, with the Department of State, we use institutions. The United Nations is a big proponent in diplomacy. But then there's also so much use in the military where it's like, are any of these schools of thought right? Is there something else entirely? What's the thinking?
You come at an interesting time where there are a lot more questions coming up now about, what was this liberal world order all about? Is it still functional in today's system? And I come back to the short versus long-term view. And I do think that, decades ago, we found that it would be in America's own self-interest to have, a freer world with, more democracies and the rule of law and freer trade and more engagement. And I still think that that's true, but we need to go back and take a look at what the costs have been of certain decisions. I think you can take a realist lens if you kind of expand that length of time you're looking at, and you can apply it to this liberal world order and come out with the answers of whether or not, in the long-term view, is it in, is this particular transaction, deciding to do X with Y country, is that in our long-term view, even if there are short-term, humanitarian costs to it, for example. And I think that you can overlay those two ways of thinking if you get a longer vision and find a way to have kind of a realistic progressive approach to our foreign policy. It's interesting topic foreign policy is, because it's not clearly, there's not clearly a conservative foreign policy and a progressive foreign policy. There's a lot of overlay. You can't peg what a Republican's going to think on foreign policy because he's a Republican, and same with a Democrat. They're hawks and doves, they're interventionist and non-interventionist. But I think that most of those ways of looking at foreign policy really all of them fall prey to kind of short-term thinking. And I think we need to, the way to change our thinking on it gets back to what Christopher had mentioned, which is what are our American interests? And we need to define that and define what the principles are that we want to espouse in the world, and look at how those interactions, how our interactions will affect those values and those principles in different countries around the world, and start to lay it out that way without having a, without it being, you got security or you got human rights, right? Like you can have both of these things if you're looking at the long-term view.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our several panelists, and thank you especially to Lizzie for joining us and for your time and all that you shared. Now, I wish I could say, outside in the hall, we've got a book table and Lizzie will sign copies of her book, but I can't say that. So she's got one. Yeah, I've got one. So do all our panelists. And you could have one too, through the wonders of the internet. So if you're interested and you want to learn more, the book is entitled The Dissent Channel. So thank you again. And thanks everybody for joining us, and have a good evening. Take care.
Thank you.